Hello and good morning, everyone. I just want to take a moment to thank you all for being here and to thank David and Humber for inviting me on behalf of the First Nations Information Governance Center to be here and talk with you all today. I realize there's a lot of other presentations and great knowledge being shared today, so I really want to thank you guys all for your time today. Um, just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Briana Linton. I am a Knowledge Translation Officer with the First Nations Information Governance Center, or FNIGC. I've been with the organization for about 4 years now. I started as an IM IT student, moved over to the research department for a little bit, and now I am in communications as a knowledge translation officer. And I just want to start off with a quick land acknowledgement. So we're meeting on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. Yeah, so today we're going to be looking at First Nations data for First Nations communities, kind of a broad topic, but we'll get into the outline. So quickly, just wanted to talk a little bit about FNIGC, who we are and what we do, and then talking a little bit about First Nations data sovereignty, what that is, and then a little bit about our survey work, and then the First Nations Data Center, and then a little bit of knowledge translation at FNIGC. All right, so who is FNIGC, the First Nations Information Governance Center, and what do we do? So for about 30 years, FNIGC has been Canada's leading source of information about First Nations people living on reserve and in northern communities. And we're really committed to furthering the betterment of communities and the health and well-being of First Nations people as a whole. So based on Akwesasne and Ottawa, we are an independent, apolitical, and technical nonprofit organization with a mandate from the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs and Assembly. And we're governed by a regionally representative board of directors from across Canada. And as you can see here, our overarching vision and mission really has to do with supporting First Nations in achieving data sovereignty. And data sovereignty really looks different based on each nation's distinct worldview. But essentially, it means that First Nations people have the right to determine how data about them or from them is collected, accessed, interpreted, managed, and disseminated. And within this mandate, we also do a bunch of different things like research activities and knowledge sharing. I'll get into that in a little bit. So a little bit more about how we came to be. So as I mentioned, we are mandated by the Assembly of First Nations, and this mandate came as a result of activities that began in 1994, where 3 major national longitudinal surveys were launched by the federal government, also known as Statistics Canada, that had specifically excluded First Nations communities and First Nations living in northern communities. And as a result of this, First Nations and Inuit leadership called for a First Nations and Inuit designed survey to be conducted in place of their absence in the federal ones. So as a result, the National Steering Committee of the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey, also known as the RHS, was established in 1996. And the name was changed in 2003 to the First Nations Information Governance Committee, as the Inuit withdrew to conduct their own work in this space. And FNIGC, now referring to, the C is now referring to as a center rather than a committee, as we were federally incorporated in April 2010. So as I mentioned before, we're governed by a regionally representative board of directors from across Canada. And really a lot of our work is just to support data sovereignty in First Nations. And I just want to point out that we as an organization can't define what data sovereignty looks like or what OCAP looks like. And OCAP, if you guys haven't heard of it before, is a set of standards and principles that help really set a framework for First Nations to practice and assert data sovereignty. I'll get into a little bit more about OCAP later, but just to mention as I'm talking about it now. So as a rights holding nations, First Nations must define what data sovereignty looks like in their own communities. And we cannot prescribe what is needed and what is important to each First Nations, but we can really help them in achieving data sovereignty at a national level. All right, so this is our team. We've grown a lot since COVID. We're now about over 50 employees from really all across Canada. Most of our employees are based in Ottawa. However, we have people from all across Canada working with us. This picture was really recent, actually. This was at our staff retreat that happened earlier this month. We try to get together at least once a year to kind of connect, and it's a really great team. We do a lot of great things for FNIGC. Okay, so a little bit more about what we do at FNIGC. So as I'd mentioned in the previous slides, we do national surveys for First Nations people living on reserve and in northern communities. So with oversight from our regional partners, we have the First Nations Regional Health Survey, which I mentioned earlier, the First Nations Regional Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey, also known as FNREES. We also do First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey, FNLED, and then more recently, a First Nations Regional Social Survey, which is still currently in development, but it will really focus on youth and children. And I just want to take a moment to point out that our surveys are really national. So all of the data that FNIGC houses is national level. The regional and community data is stewarded and held by the regions themselves. So FNIGC works with the different regions to coordinate survey collection efforts, but we as FNIGC only hold national level data. And then within the work from surveys, we also do different research projects, and our research processes and methodologies really incorporate First Nations perspectives of well-being and involve First Nations in the development, implementation, data collection, analysis, and dissemination. And then we also conduct other research that aligns with First Nations priorities, and that really comes out of the survey work that we do. And then within our research department, we also have the First Nations Data Center, which I'll talk about a bit later. But really this is contains free access and then of published data, and then a fee-based access to raw and unpublished data at the national level. So then the Data Sovereignty Research Collaborative. So this is one of our newer departments in the organization. So I think it's only about a month old now. And really they're focused on conducting research that advances data sovereignty and information governance in First Nations. So they're really focused on exploring policies and legislations and processes and looking at existing barriers that First Nations experience in asserting their own data sovereignty. So they look at things, research in different areas such as legislation, intellectual property, data linkages, open data and big data, and then research data management, as well as biobanking and genomic research. And then we also have an education and training department, which really leads education and training on First Nations data sovereignty, information governance and management, as well as the OCAP principles, which I'll get into in a few slides. And then we also have the First Nations Data Governance Strategy, so also known as the FNDGS, lots of acronyms. So the FNDGS is described as a pathway for building the capacities needed to fully exercise data sovereignty. The strategy envisions a First Nations-led national network of regional information governance centers across the country, which are equipped with the knowledge, skills, and capacities needed to serve the information needs of First Nations people and communities at the regional level. So the First Nations Data Governance Strategy really charts the path necessary to realize First Nations data sovereignty that aligns with each First Nations worldview, and thus further advances First Nations self-determination. So this is a collective vision for the future as articulated by First Nations leadership and rights holders and data sovereignty experts. This is a really big piece of work that FNIGC is currently conducting. So I just wanted to play a little video that can explain the FNDGS a lot better than I can. We don't have speakers, but I think my laptop should be loud enough to hopefully cover it.
Of knowing and being began to break down, creating a void between who we are today and who the Creator intended us to be. Yet despite these hardships, we are a strong and resilient peoples with a proud history and an even brighter future. In this era of reconciliation, a new story is being written. This story sees us taking back what is ours. It sees us exercising our rights to self-determination and self-government. But to do this, we must also exercise our rights over our information, over our knowledge, over our data. In a rapidly evolving digital economy, data in the form of information, statistics, and research is key. To date, Canada has been and is still collecting our data, comparing our quality of life, and planning our futures without our input or consent. We have been forced to fit into a mold that is not of our making or of our choosing. So we are at a loss for reliable, relevant data that speaks for us from our worldview. Our data must belong to us. It comes from us. It connects us. It defines who we are, and it has the power to guide us in building our future in our own image. It is our asset, our legacy. Like all governments in the world, our own governments must be empowered by reliable data to do their jobs, to make informed decisions, and to plan for the future. For this reason, our leaders have been advocating for rights over our data. However, the recognition of our rights over data is not enough. We need to build capacities to meaningfully preserve and leverage our data in impactful ways. And although we have been collecting data, significant gaps remain, leaving many of our communities behind. That's why, as directed by Chiefs in Assembly, the First Nations Information Governance Center and its regional partners developed a strategy from the ground up with the goal of building data capacities that our communities and leaders need. This strategy, our plan, is all about establishing fully functional, non-political, and expert-driven regional information governance centers, one in every region led by First Nations. These regional centers, or regional hubs, will provide a suite of shared data and statistical services to all communities, their governments, advocacy organizations, and service delivery agencies. Leveraging economies of scale in every region, communities and organizations will have access to the digital infrastructure and professional expertise they need to govern, access, and repatriate their data, leveraging its power. So what's next? The implementation will be community-driven and nation-based, rolling out in phases. Phase 1 starts now with the recruitment of a dedicated data champion team in every region that will engage leadership and help them define how these regional centers will be governed and what priority data capacities and services will they offer. To build a solid foundation, this first phase needs to focus on the blueprints before we start to invest in the brick and mortar. This work is expected to take about 3 years, with each region advancing at its own pace. Once completed, we will move to phase 2. That's when we will bring our blueprints to life. Never has the timing been so right and the opportunity so within our reach. Our leaders have been trailblazing this path for years, and the Canadian government has responded with significant funding to implement our plan. With this strategy, we will build our own data governance and statistical institutions, and they will be equipped with the modern capacities we need to hold and use all our data. It will be our legacy for the next 7 generations to come.
Okay, so yeah, that was a video the FNDGS team, I think, made about 2 years ago. I think we're starting phase 2. So it's really great work. It's a lot of work, but we're working with our regions to build those data centers, which is very important for, data sovereignty. Let's see here. Okay, so looking a little bit at what is First Nations data sovereignty. So I think we covered that a little bit in the last few slides, but looking a little bit more closely at what it is, we have to start with what is First Nations data. So as we have seen, First Nations data is critical to self-government and self-determination efforts. So looking at what exactly First Nations data is, it's not just data about First Nations people, but it's actually including data about lands, resources, and the environment, including its animals, medicines, climate patterns. And it also includes data about First Nations, such as demographics, socioeconomic and health, housing, infrastructure, and service utilization. But it also includes data from First Nations, so things like languages, cultures, stories, songs, and ceremonies. So essentially, it's First Nations intellectual property, historic and contemporary data, as well as survey data, administrative data, and data from alternative sources, including data generated through research activities. And just wanted to note that First Nations data is really held by so many organizations that are non-Indigenous in different institutions. For example, Indigenous Services Canada alone holds over 200 databases of First Nations data, so data about housing, health, education, employment, band elections, and child welfare, for example. And this over collection of data that's not led by First Nations still continues today. So historically, data about First Nations and collected by First Nations from the government has really been of no use to First Nations people. And I think touching on the FNDGS video a little bit, a big part of that is that it's not First Nations led. So as we know, First Nations have their own well-being systems and their own knowledges about what health looks like. And if they're not leading survey collection and data collection, it's likely that the data isn't relevant to them. Okay, so First Nations data sovereignty. So as we know, First Nations are sovereign nations, and that meaning that they have the jurisdiction to govern and make laws, manage, control, and make decisions about their own people. And they have the inherent right to govern their peoples, lands, and resources. And data is really critical to this. And First Nations data sovereignty is really, as we mentioned before, the right to exercise authority over its data and information, and includes the right to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data, and to protect the traditional knowledge and cultural expressions and intellectual property. It really reflects First Nations desires and interests to manage information in ways that are consistent with their own laws, practices, and customs. And First Nations data sovereignty is a crucial step towards nation self-governance, aspirations, and exercise of self-determination. So this is bringing us to our principles of OCAP, which I had mentioned earlier. So OCAP is really a framework for First Nations to assert and exercise their rights for data sovereignty, and it stands for the ownership, control, access, and possession. And so the ideas inherent in OCAP are not new, and in fact, they have been asserted by First Nations for a very long time. First Nations leaders understand the importance of building the tools to implement and exercise the principles of OCAP so they can assert and exercise their rights as sovereign nations. And having ownership, control, access, and possession of First Nations data will give First Nations leaders the building blocks to assert their own self-government. So it's just about a little over a year now, FNIGC relaunched the online version of their Fundamentals of OCAP course to help mark the 25th anniversary of the First Nations Principles of OCAP. So they've been around for a while. And more recently, just this past summer, it was also launched in French. And so the course is really intended for First Nations individuals who work with data and are asserting First Nations principles of OCAP in their own work. But it's also really recommended for any individuals that interact with First Nations data or information and are looking to learn how they can respect the principles of OCAP within their own work. And so I just have one more video to kind of explain the principles of OCAP and what that looks like through a First Nations lens.
First Nations people have always understood the value of community. the importance of respect, and the need to protect our resources for future generations. And today, one of our most important resources is information. First Nations people have always been information gatherers. When we track and hunt or gather food from the land, we're engaging in information gathering that has a direct and important impact on our lives. First Nations people understand that information isn't just about numbers and surveys. It's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination. That's why the First Nation Information Governance Center was created. Since 1996, its mission has been to uphold the values of OCAP, a set of principles designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information, and ensure that First Nations people are the stewards of their own information. OCAP ensures that First Nations people have ownership both individually and collectively as a community. It puts them in control so that they can decide how it is used, by whom, and under what conditions. It ensures that they have the right to determine and define access regardless of where it is held. And it defines possession, ensuring that they have the power to use their information for the benefit of their own communities. Possession is key to making ownership, access, and control possible. Taking together, the First Nations principles of OCAP embody one important idea, that First Nations people understand their own needs and are in the best position to govern their own information. The right of First Nations communities to own, control, access, and possess information about their peoples is fundamentally tied to self-determination and to the preservation and development of their culture.
Okay, so just looking quickly at each principle of OCAP. So ownership. So this principle states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that a person owns their own personal information. And just to note that ownership is very distinct from stewardship. So the stewardship or custodianship of data or information, which might be held by an institution that is accountable to the group, is a mechanism which through ownership can be maintained, but it's very distinct. Ownership is kind of looking at the actual ownership of the data, who owns it and where it's at. So historically, First Nations data, if used, the personal identifying information will be removed, but not the community identifiers. So this can and has allowed the publication of community data without the community knowing or giving its consent for this publication to occur. And obviously that can cause harms. You know, First Nations communities can be very small, and so it's easy to identify them, you know, based on just community identifiers. So this is kind of bringing back the reason that ownership of data is so important. So communities themselves should own the data and be able to govern what that ownership looks like. So the next principle is control. So when we talk about control, we're really looking at how First Nations are able to assert control over research processes, really being able to have control of from grant writing to dissemination of data and what that looks like. So looking at the collection, use, and disclosure of information. And then access. So they should be able to really control who has access to the data. Yeah, pretty self-explanatory. And then possession. So this is looking at the actual physical holding of the data. So where is the data located and who has possession of it? Okay, so looking a little bit closely at our survey work. So I mentioned our national surveys in the beginning, but I just wanted to look a little bit closer at them. So we conduct 3 different surveys currently, and the surveys produce culturally relevant health information that First Nations can use to help create changes in their communities, influence decision making, and then set policies and programs to help improve health outcomes. The first survey is the First Nations Regional Health Survey. Currently, we are in phase 4, so this will be the 4th iteration of the Regional Health Survey. So we're currently in the data collection phase. And just a note that it was originally created as a longitudinal study, but the regions really saw the need for continuous updates to the survey. So each year, new collection or each iteration of the regional health survey, new data is collected based on the current needs and contexts of community. And so this is the first and only national First Nations health survey, which collects wide-ranging information about First Nations people living on reserve in northern communities. And it's really based on First Nations understanding of well-being and not that Western view, which can be a little bit obviously not as relevant to First Nations communities having their own knowledge bases and understandings of well-being. We also conduct the First Nations Regional Early Childhood Education and Employment Survey, so FNREES. This was created to address a long-standing data gap that existed around early childhood education and development, youth employment and education, as well as adult employment and education, and labor market conditions in First Nations communities. So the First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey, FNLED, is a new national survey initiative that gathers labor market information about employment, labor jobs, and skills in First Nations communities across Canada. And again, so FNIGC only hosts national level data. So the our survey team works with regional partners to develop and administer the surveys, but it is the region's job to really collect their own data and govern what that process looks like. So they'll hire their own community members and train them to collect their own data. So really it benefits communities right down to the individual level. And because the surveys themselves are First Nations, it's really different than the data that, say, StatsCan collects. As I mentioned before, it really encompasses the holistic view of First Nations health, since they are the ones that create the surveys themselves. And then just to note that all of our surveys and questionnaires are all found online. So if anyone's ever interested in looking up those, they're all on our online library. And I just went through a lot of information, not quite done yet, but I just wanted to take a moment to ask if anyone had questions at this point about anything that we've been through already. No. Okay, I'll keep going. So the First Nations Data Center. So this is hosted in our research department at FNIGC. So a little bit about the physical structure of the First Nations Data Centers. So it's a physical location in our Ottawa office. So it's really a locked office with all of our servers of the national level data. It's really limited in who has access. And then all employees, like everyone in the organization doesn't have access to the FNDC, but just as an extra level of protection, we make sure that everybody at FNIGC takes the fundamentals of OCAP course. And then anybody who is accessing the FNDC has to sign confidentiality agreements. And there's a lot of different levels of security, such as outputting and vetting and encryption with the data. So this is a really, so FNDC is a service provided by FNIGC, and it really manages access to unpublished tables and record level data at the national level. It's available to approve applicants pursuing research, policy development, program planning, or evaluation on a cost recovery basis. So really there's two ways that it works. The first being that individuals can submit a request for tables, so unpublished data that's not published in our reports online. And then there is another option for on-site data access. This one isn't done as much anymore. A lot of it's done virtually through our online request form, but the option is there for those that want on-site data access. And then just another reminder, so regional level data access is required through the regions, so we don't necessarily conduct that ourselves. We can connect people to regions if they wanted regional level data, but us at FNIGC, we just work on the national level data. And then community level data would be a step further. So you'd talk to the regions and then the regions would connect you with the communities themselves, and then they would make decisions on how their data is accessed. So to access the data center, there is an online data request form that's hosted on our website. So individuals can fill out that application, and then it goes through a series of approval processes, which we'll look at in a second. We're currently in the process of updating our online data request form, so it looks a little outdated right now, but I would say in a month it's going to be updated, and yeah, so that's exciting. Okay, so this is a little overview of the approval process for data access. Um, so the time it takes to progress through the process really varies depending on the complexity and the sensitivity of the data that is being requested. Each phase may require some back and forth between the applicant and FNIGC staff. And at oftentimes, there's at least 2 to 3 revisions needed between the time that someone first puts in a request and then when the request is either approved or denied. So the first 2 phases are done concurrently for data table requests, but for on-site data access requests, the methodological review takes a lot more time. So the first step is an internal technical review. So essentially, this is when FNIGC will review the request from and make sure that it is clear, complete, and reflects the information the applicant is. So it's really representative of what they're actually trying to access, essentially. So depending on what they're looking for, it really differs on how much time it may take. And the final outputs, or sorry, the final review is a research advisory working group, which is often an external group of delegates from regional partner organizations. And it kind of works like an ethics review. So considering the request's potential risks and benefits to community, our external group will go through those. And the request is refined at each phase and until it has met the criteria of the reviewers. Yeah, so it's quite a lengthy process, but very important, and it's kind of how the data center really asserts the OCAP principles with its data. So this is just a short list of some of the considerations that the requests will go through. So is there sensitive variables involved? And then it'll undergo a risk-benefit analysis, so really ensuring that the benefit to communities is priority and that there isn't much risk based on the release of the data. And then does the requester have experience working with First Nations communities? And is there support from a First Nations organization? And then important consideration is has the data requester undergone the OCAP training principles? I'm sure most times that's if they haven't, they will make sure that they've undergone that training first. And then another important consideration is if First Nations will be involved in the interpretation of the results. And then how will the results be disseminated? Who will it be shared with and how? And then does the proposal meet the overall requirements of the OCAP principles? Okay, moving on to knowledge translation. So looking first at the Knowledge Lodge and the online library. So at FNIGC, we're consistently working to improve the way we share our research and data findings with First Nations communities and individuals working within First Nations health and social development spaces. So on our website, fnigc.ca, there's currently 2 areas where we are focusing our efforts, which are the Knowledge Lodge and the online library. So first looking at the Knowledge Lodge, this is our free-to-use online data tool, which houses more than 500 data items in the form of interactive charts and graphs. And these are all coming from our research reports and survey data. So the Knowledge Lodge allows you to search through different categories, surveys, and keywords to find data that can be used by community, students, researchers, policymakers, and decision makers to help their work within First Nations communities. And I'll go through the Knowledge Lodge in a second here, but the charts and graphs have different export options as well, so they're really easy to insert into presentations and reports. And just a note that the most recent additions to the Knowledge Lodge include data items from a recent research project that was exploring the relationship between cannabis and mental well-being in a First Nations context. And then just to quickly talk about our online library. This is where we house all of our reports and surveys and questionnaires, as well as some of our knowledge translation publications. And so a little bit about some of our knowledge translation publications. Some of our recent publications include First Nations guides to various legislations that impact First Nations data sovereignty, in addition to our cannabis and mental well-being toolkit, which is related to that research project that I was just mentioning. And we are looking to have more knowledge translation publications in the near future. So I'm just going to go over the Knowledge Lodge a little bit more detail. Hopefully this opens up. So this is our, as I mentioned, our free to use knowledge tool. So unlike the data center, which requires, oh, it's not showing. 1 second. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is on our website. So you can enter the Knowledge Lodge, or you on Google, First Nations Information Governance Center Knowledge Lodge, or you could just go to our website and it'll be under Explore Available Data here. So as I was mentioning, this is our free to use tool, unlike the data center, which requires a whole request process and a cost per use basis. This is our free tool that we have just recently updated. So as I was mentioning, it's broken down by survey. So we have the FNREs, the RHS, the most recent phase 3, and then the previous phase 2 from 2008, 2010. So you can search the data based on these surveys, but you can also filter by categories. So these are generally how our surveys are broken down, looking at different health topics. And then you can also search keywords if you're looking for something a little more specific. But just to show you an example, go to language and culture and then hit submit. And it will come up with all of the charts and graphs that pertain to that category. So this is a good example of a chart here. And as I was mentioning before, there's different export options. So you can export it in different images, but then you can also download it into Excel or a CSV file. And then another thing about the Knowledge Lodge is because it's knowledge translation focused, we really wanted to make it as easy to understand the data as possible. So not as necessary for charts, but if I can get a table, you can see here that we've removed a lot of like the data fluff, like we don't have a lot of confidence intervals, nothing too confusing because we really wanted this to be as straightforward as possible. That was important for us. But if you are looking for like confidence intervals and more information around the data, more context, for example, there's always a link to the full report attached to each data item. So if you click that, it should take you to the exact location within the report that it's coming from, which can give you more information, those confidence intervals, a bit more decimals, and that sort of thing. Yeah, so that is our Knowledge Lodge. There's lots of good information on here. There's about 500 charts, and we're always updating it and adding more as our new surveys are completed and new research projects are coming out. And then just a little last piece about our recent knowledge translation publication, which I had mentioned before. This research project was looking at cannabis and mental well-being in First Nations communities. It was originally funded by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and it's supported by the Assembly of First Nations, and it really aims to contribute to a holistic, culturally grounded and balanced representation of First Nations data and knowledges surrounding the relationship between cannabis and mental wellness. And as a component of the research project, we created the Community Toolkit, which can be best understood as a conversation guide to help facilitate open, non-stigmatizing conversations and learning about the relationship between cannabis and mental wellness in a First Nations context. And so the toolkit was really built on the qualitative findings of the report. And this idea of creating this type of toolkit was really brought up by our advisory committee, who was extremely helpful in grounding the whole research project from very early on. And so the advisory group was made up of community experts with lived experience in First Nations communities, and their involvement and feedback in the creation of the toolkit really allowed us to tailor the toolkit to the needs of First Nations communities. And so the main guiding factor for us in creating the toolkit was that we don't really want to tell First Nations people how to feel or how to use cannabis, but more so to allow them to have open conversations and kind of fill in their own context into the data, which is important because, as I mentioned a few times now, FNIGC is really a national organization. So the data and what cannabis looks like in communities will really differ based on the different communities' context. So yeah, we're really proud of this publication. It was really well received by First Nations communities. We launched it at the Assembly of First Nations annual General Assembly this past summer. And we had a lot of great conversations with communities about the different contexts that the data would be useful in. Yeah, so I just wanted to give an example of one of our recent knowledge translation publications. And we're hoping to do more of that in the future. Okay, so that was the presentation. So thank you, everybody. I left a couple different contact informations up there. So the general inquiries, if anyone wants more information about the data center, surveys or research, feel free to message that inbox. And then the First Nations Data Center specifically, and then my contact as well if anyone has further questions.